All right, so now let's look at different ways that we can store information into our long-term memory. So we're going to look at different strategies that help boost information retrieval and actively encode information that can be done and used oftentimes that we use in the classroom. And maybe this can also help you study as well. One of the key things that we often are susceptible to is rote memorization. So, rote memory is a learning technique where students repeat certain facts or figures until it's instilled in their memory bank. The concept behind this strategy is that students will be able to quickly recall the meaning of a material the more they repeat it without making active or meaningful connections to prior knowledge. So this typically leads to memorizing a lot of different facts at a very fast pace, but without really holding any kind of meaningful connection. We're not making that alignment to what you might have already known or so information that's in our prior knowledge. And while it could be useful as a starting point towards meaningful learning, cramming almost always leads to students to forget immediately after the exam. So we've all maybe done this at one point or another where we're memorizing a ton of facts, we're memorizing a ton of definitions and concepts and maybe mechanisms, and then we go take the exam, we regurgitate all that information onto a piece of paper or on that exam, and then immediately after the exam, because we don't practice it, because we're not using that information anymore, we completely forget all of that information. And so one of the kind of caveats with using rote memorization is that without the rehearsal over time through distributed practice versus just doing it all at one time the night before the exam, we often forget that kind of information. That information does make it into the long term memory because we're able to then recall it when we take the exam. But oftentimes, that information, without the rehearsal and the maintenance, without constantly actively retrieving and encoding that information over a period of time, that information does get lost or forgotten without the proper retrieval cues. Another aspect is chunking. We talked about chunking earlier, but I wanted to dive in a little bit deeper as to what chunking is. A chunking activity involves breaking down difficult text into more manageable pieces and having students rewrite these chunks in their own words. We've all like maybe experienced like, oh, how should we be taking notes? Should we just be writing the information that we see that's on the lecture screen, or maybe that's on a board? Or do we sort of write it in our own way that makes sense to us, right? And if you're doing the latter, you're actively making connections to what you already know based on your prior knowledge and what you don't know. And so, this technique of chunking, especially in reading or rewriting notes or texts, can be really helpful. This can be utilized in challenging texts at any length or maybe challenging lecture material, reading books. Chunking helps learners identify keywords and ideas and develops the ability to help them summarize, to elaborate, to critically think about the information that they're encountering and how that information actually makes sense to that individual. And so it makes it easier for them to organize and then synthesize information. Other examples include breaking down a dance choreography into many parts. If you've ever taken a dance class, or maybe you are a dancer at UCI, UCI has a ton of different dance crews. Oftentimes, you're learning an 8 count first, or maybe you're even learning a 4 count first. So you're learning the moves to these dance moves in the order and the sequence that they were envisioned, and then you build upon these, 4 counts, then 8 counts, then you add another 8 count into finally culminating into the entire dance choreography. Other things also include segmenting long lecture videos into smaller parts. You can see that with that example in this course. I take, try to structure information like you see on the right table of contents, breaking it down into and organizing it into specific key concepts, and then recording these shorter, maybe like 5 to 10 minute videos instead of one long 45-minute video that you have to watch. And other examples also include spacing out your studying across several days. So let's say you might have to read the textbook for this class, but you're like thinking about how you might chunk it. So, maybe you're reading just the information processing assumptions or the sensory register part for this first hour. You're taking the notes down and you're separating it out over a span of a week so that by the time you get to the end of the week, you are able to now think about all the information that you've learned and then apply and practice and actively recall and encode that information over a period of time rather than just studying the night before the exam. So I have an image here where it says, oh, I crammed before the test, right? And then there have an influx of all this information that's coming in. And then forget it all afterwards when they take the exam. Their brain is empty there. So in order for information to make it into our long-term memory, we really want learning to be active. We want learners to have a active role, active learning, or student-centered learning experience. We've all heard this. We also want learning to be intentional, goal-directed. That way that when you are making a plan to study, you have intentions and specific objectives that you want to get out of studying or learning. We also want it to be authentic in some way, being situated based on whatever the content that we're learning. We want it to be constructive, where we might articulate ourselves, articulate our own understanding, maybe working with a peer to validate some of the things that you're learning. One of the best ways to get things into long-term memory, or even just studying more generally, is to teach that information back to your friend who might be in the same class. So having a collaborative and cooperative, even conversational moment about the concepts that you're learning can really help actively encode and retrieve information that's in our working memory and maintain that information into our long-term memory. So really, we're trying to get into this notion or this pedagogical framework of meaningful learning. So meaningful learning is the act of higher order thinking. So this is where you're thinking and inferring, you're making judgments about the concepts that you're learning, and development through intellectual engagement that uses patterns and recognition and concept associations. One of the key things that I want you to draw from this class is to recognize the different kinds of patterns and recognizing the different kinds of associations. So, in the previous weeks, we were learning about reinforcement or punishment, positive and negative, recognizing those patterns between what is positive, what is considered positive reinforcement, or what is considered negative reinforcement. How can we recognize those patterns so that when we take an exam or when we talk about the concepts that we've learned, we can easily make those connections? So it involves making connections between different topics or ideas and deeply comprehending the material for it to be remembered. It's a type of learning that connects new knowledge with prior knowledge, right? And that statement there really kind of sounds like the process of assimilation and accommodation, right? So it's thinking about how can we take information, new information that we're learning, maybe we know parts of it, maybe we don't know parts of it. How can we either add to our existing knowledge space to further develop that schema, or how can we change the information that is not aligned so we can develop new schemas? So examples include critical and creative thinking, inquiry-based learning, problem-based learning, and problem solving. We're going to be covering that in a couple weeks. Critical discourse, so that's maybe like a seminar talking about differing views with students in your class, and metacognitive skills as well. And we'll be covering metacognition next week as well. So when we do meaningful learning, what's actually happening is we are elaborating, or we're going through this process of elaboration where we're using our prior knowledge to embellish new knowledge, storing more information in the process. So that's taking what you already know, the new information that we have, and elaborating on our knowledge base. So using your own examples for different key terms is one example of elaboration. Organization is where we're making connections among new pieces of information by categorizing or creating relationships. So one of the things that you could do is when you're creating maybe flashcards, or maybe you're using some of the interactive flashcard decks that I have, you might group certain elements or concepts together in a particular key area that makes it more meaningful. So organizing that information. So an example of that is examining the relationship between the memory components to see how they work together. So sensory register, working memory, long-term memory, grouping it into specific organizations or categories to see how they then fit within the bigger picture. Another way is visualization. So like forming a mental picture of something or how it works. We can also do kind of like a journey map, or we can do a concept map where we have information that, a big concept that then breaks out into these other micro concepts that are related to something that we're learning. So thinking of educational scaffolding, we talked about scaffolding with social constructivism and how your more knowledgeable other might break things down through a visual representation. And so, kind of the last advice that I have for long term memory strategies is that if you practice like you play, you'll play like you practice. What I mean by that is we think about maybe, maybe you're on a sports team, and oftentimes when you're actually competing at a match, let's say, like a basketball game, it's a high pressure situation. So we want to actually, when we're practicing, we want to practice in high pressure situations. So if we take it back to maybe an educational context, if you're studying for an exam, you want to make sure you're studying and using the techniques that with whatever technique that you're using that's going to try and simulate the exam conditions. So maybe when you're studying, you want to put yourself in, add a little pressure to your learning, or you want to focus on those really difficult exams that concepts that you might have issues with, and really practice those exams. If your instructor is really focused on using examples in class, and you know that the exam is going to have a lot of example applied everyday situation types of questions, maybe those are the types of questions you want to focus on. So if you practice like you'll play like you practice.